really the question about the nuclear bomb. So, so to start, let's just talk a little bit about definitions, like we always do, and make sure we're clear in our thinking and all of this. So, fifth commandment, right? Thou shalt not kill. Let's talk just for a second about what that means and doesn't mean. Um, Roman Catechism says killing in a just war and killing by accident are among the other exceptions to this commandment. The soldier is guiltless who, in a just war, takes the life of an enemy, provided that he is not actuated by motives of ambition or cruelty, but by a pure desire to serve the interests of his country. Again, death caused not by intent or design, but by accident is not murder. All right, and so the as we talk about this as we go through today, one of the key words that's really important for Stoics, especially if we talk about this, is the key word innocent, right? The commandment is really thou shalt not uh, take an innocent life, or thou shalt not kill or murder, and things like killing in just war, in a just war, assuming there is no other way, and all the usual caveats, is not uh, morally illicit. Okay, and so very often people are try to absolutize things like this, like, oh well, that means you can't kill anyone for any reason, and then you very quickly sort of talk about how in self-defense we're justified in killing the person if there's no other way to neutralize them. And in fact, in certain situations, not just in self-defense, but when we are obligated to protect the lives of people that we have been given charge over or whatever. And so with that obligation comes the fact that we may, in order to stop a threat, have to actually kill the person. Okay, so just to throw out the sort of superficial argument against war, killing in war, again, assuming a just war, which we'll talk about in a little bit, um, is not morally illicit. Okay, um, and to see sort of how so the Catholic, especially between Augustine and Aquinas, and we'll talk about this as we go through, they sort of are the ones who sort of, St. Ambrose to a certain extent, sort of articulated what became the just war doctrine, or the just war theory. And most Christians will, for the most part, agree with it and sort of subscribe to it in the way that they formulated it. And in Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis talks about just war, and this we're going to come back to Lewis sort of later, because he wrote a sort of an influential essay called "Why I'm Not a Pacifist." And for Lewis, who was somebody who was wounded in war, he saw that war in certain situations and going to war was an obligation. And so that's a very Catholic way of understanding. And so he says in Mere Christianity, he says, we may in wartime kill if necessary, but we must never hate and enjoy hating. So what he's sort of getting at here is our personal disposition, the disposition of the soldier, right? When the soldier enters into battle, it's not out of hate for his enemy, okay? And it's not out of this desire for cruelty. It's a matter of him defending his country, okay, and defending his homeland. We may punish if necessary, but we must not enjoy it. In other words, something inside of us, the feeling of resentment, the feeling that wants to get one's own back, must be simply killed. It is hard work, but the attempt is not impossible. And so what he wants us to sort of grasp and to understand is that a soldier can't be motivated by vengeance, okay? But nevertheless, he has to be motivated by justice. And so the two key words that we're going to talk about today are innocent and just, okay? If you walk away with those two sort of principles to guide us in what we're doing, then everything will make sense. And you'll see too, as we get into the just war doctrine, that it's just basically Catholic morality applied to the situation of war, okay? All right. So let's give us one more sort of definition, and then we can sort of get into the nitty-gritty of it. Okay, so peace. All right, so everyone wants peace, right? Although not everyone sort of understands how to get peace. And so in the City of God, St. Augustine talks about uh, sort of how peace comes about, okay? And he talks about peace between man and man. He talks about domestic peace, the peace of the family. Then he talks about civil peace. And then he talks about the peace of the celestial city. And he says all these things have one thing in common. They're ordered, okay? And so he says peace is the tranquility of order, all right? And so if you want peace in your soul, what do you have to do? You have to have a well-ordered soul. You have to be virtuous. You have to be have a right relationship with God and in a right relationship with other people. Okay, that's where peace comes from. All right, and it's that relationship with other people that we begin to see that without justice there can't be peace. Okay, so justice is simply big picture, the correct ordering of relationships between people. Okay, and so this St. Augustine will talk about there being a just peace and an unjust peace. So he doesn't just leave peace out there, because someone could be at peace with something, and he talks about in his example in the City of God, he talks about like a band of robbers who lives a really well disciplined life, and they seem to be sort of at peace with it. But he talks about that being an unjust peace and not really true peace. Peace only comes about through justice. And so he makes the distinction between an unjust peace and a just peace. Notice too that he doesn't talk about there being an absence of conflict to have peace. Okay, and so um, so peace isn't just the absence of war. And in fact, as we're going to talk about, war can actually be at times a means to bring about peace. And that sort of strikes people as odd at first, but hopefully by the time we're done, it won't. So anyway, so sort of two take homes from peace is it's not the sort of the absence. It's not the absence of conflict, and then also the fact that it's not something you can aim for directly, right? It's essentially a side effect or a fruit of a well-ordered society, well-ordered soul, or whatever. So even in our own spiritual lives, if you do not have peace, you do not have order in your life. Okay, and so the way to get sort of the sign that you're living a well-ordered life is that you have peace. Okay, all right. All right, so that's sort of our definitional, where we sort of define our terms, and let's sort of go into the just war theory a little bit. And throughout this semester, I haven't used definitions in the catechisms that much. Well, just because we were looking for something a little deeper, a little broader. But the catechism has about 5 or 6 paragraphs on just war that are really good. And really capture the tradition well. So we're going to sort of rely on those today. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the name of it. First of all, you'll often hear it sort of called the just war theory, but that's sort of a misnomer. It's not a theory as to how a just war might be carried out. It's more of just how justice can be expressed through and in war. Okay, so it's essentially meant to be a way that a moral response in the face of some social political evil and some grave injustice. Okay, and so interestingly enough, again, it's aiming at peace, but it always aims at peace through justice. And so it essentially says that one of the obligations of any head of a society, be it a father of a family, or a president or a king, is that they have a moral obligation to bring about peace in their society. Okay, and so and that again comes about only from the tranquility that comes from rightly ordered human relationships. And so let's read the definition, and then we'll talk just a little bit about what it permits, what it doesn't permit, and all that. So the evaluation of these conditions for moral legitimacy belong to the prudential judgment of those who have responsibility for the common good. Public authorities in this case have the right and duty to impose on citizens the obligations necessary for national defense. Those who are sworn to serve their country in the armed forces are servants of the security and freedom of nations.
Rob, you're breaking up on us.
Okay, hang on one second. Is that better? Is that good?
You sound better now.
Okay. If it happens again, just say something. I'll go inside. It might be just I'm too far away from the. So the just war doctrine then permits the use of force, but it's also meant to limit the use of force, and applies this specific moral criterion that we're going to talk about: just cause, right intent, legitimate authority, discrimination between non-combatants and combatants, and proportionality, which we'll get into each one of those as we sort of get into this. Okay, so what I want to do first is sort of deal with some of the objections, and begin with what is sort of the obvious objection. Okay, many Christians would say war is wrong because Jesus said to turn the other cheek. How do we respond to that?
Well, if we were subscribed to the teaching of the church, I think you've said that personal morality is different than like societal morality. So
Yeah.
that's one way.
Yeah, and that aspect of it is really important for us to grasp, right? So what is Jesus saying here? He's not saying that anytime there's violence against you, that you should just let the violence go, right? Because as we said at the very beginning, you have an obligation to protect other people, right? So he is simply saying how a Christian might respond um, personally in the face of some violence. Someone doing something unjust towards them. But there's a commandment, obviously, to we are commanded to work for justice, right? And so what I think helps when we're sort of balancing this difference between the personal and the social versus the the state versus the individual is if we go to the end of Romans chapter 12 and the beginning of chapter 13. And so I'm gonna read this and we're gonna sort of unpack it. The first part he's talking about where violence or force is in a certain sense proscribed, and then in the second case it's prescribed. So it's forbidden and then it's sort of authorized. And so St. Paul says, "Beloved, do not look for revenge, but leave room for the wrath of God. As it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. Rather, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink, for by so doing you will heap burning coals upon his head. Do not be conquered by evil, but conquer evil with good." Okay, so that's the personal sort of approach to things, right? Where the Christian isn't looking to defeat his enemy, he's looking to win him over, right? And that's what he's talking about. He's like everyone you see, no matter where you see them, is someone who are trying to convert. And so the Christian, just like Christ, doesn't smash his enemy, but instead wins them over. Okay, and again, that's not denying that we have enemies, right? And so that's why it's important not only to win them over with charity, but also to pray for our enemies. But then he shifts to the sort of social view of what to do in the face of injustice. This is, let every person be subordinate to the higher authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been established by God. Okay, we talked about this from the very beginning of the semester when we were talking about how we have to see authority coming from above, not from below. Therefore, whoever resists authority opposes what God has appointed, and those who oppose it will bring judgment upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause of fear to good conduct, but to evil. Do you wish to have fear of authority? Then have no fear of authority. Then do what is good, and you will receive approval from it. For it is a servant of God for your good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword without purpose. Okay, so what is he saying there? He's saying that that public authority bears the sword for a purpose. Okay, it is the servant of God to inflict wrath on the evildoer. Right, and so the purpose of sort of civil authority is one of the purpose is to protect the members of the society, but also to redress injustices. Okay, and so we get a good grasp, a good picture here of the individual versus the social. All right, and so anytime you're confronted with someone saying, well, Jesus said, to turn the other cheek, an eye for an eye, it makes the whole world blind, and all of that. Point them to the end of Romans 12, where there's this balance of how we should act individually versus how we should act socially. Okay. All right. So that's the first sort of exception. Okay. The second is the typical. The other one is when Jesus is threatened at the end of Matthew's gospel. He tells St. Peter picks up a sword and he says, "All that take the sword shall perish by the sword." And so, from what people often sort of take from that is that all wars are unlawful because of that. Okay, because it's the taking of the sword. St. Thomas he deals with this objection and deals with it pretty clearly. Again, drawing on St. Augustine. He says, to take the sword is to arm oneself in order to take the life of anyone without the command or permission of a superior or lawful authority. Okay. On the other hand, to have recourse to the sword as a private person by the authority of the sovereign or judge as a public person through zeal for justice and by the authority, so to speak, of God, is not to take the sword, but to use it as commissioned by another. Wherefore it does not deserve punishment. All right. So he's saying essentially there's not anything like vigilante justice that punishment has to be meted out by those in authority. And the person who is, we could say, given the sword from public authority does nothing wrong. It's when they take it themselves. Okay. And then you see then you begin to see some of the parallels in the Old Testament where God commands Israel to go to war, right? And it's this idea of being given the sword versus taking it themselves, right? So if Israel goes out and tries to conquer on their own, they end up usually losing terribly. But when they are given the sword, they tend not to. Okay. And yet, even those who make sinful use of the sword are not always slain with the sword, yet they always perish with their own sword, because unless they repent, they are punished eternally for their sinful use of the sword. So at the end, he's saying, even if, and history has plenty of examples of people taking the sword and appearing to be successful in doing so, he said in the end, they're still punished for it. Okay. And so he's saying, look at things from a supernatural perspective, from within the providence of God, rather than thinking, well, this person was successful, so therefore that I can do it too. Okay, so that's the other objection. All right, so let's sort of get at where we're going with pacifism then. Okay, Catechism again, quoting what we already talked a little bit about. Public authorities in this case have the right and duty to impose on citizens the obligations necessary for national defense. All right, and so not to act against an evildoer, okay, not to act. So what we call like a sin of omission is really, according to Augustine, sort of you're nourishing and strengthening them. You're egging them on a little bit, and you're sort of allowing them to go on, okay. And there's also the aspect that's really important about pacifism, is it's really has this utopia view of reality, right? Where it's thinking, well, you don't need to use force to stop an evil, okay? As if someone like Hitler, the pacifists could stop him from running all the way through Europe, right? And so for us to sort of get as a distinction, I think is important, because sometimes people will say things like, well, violence is always wrong. For the church, they tend to speak in terms of force versus violence, right? So they use the force is a sort of measure of power that's necessary to sort of uphold law, right, and politics, okay? And that force can be just the force of law itself. It can be the force of police. It could be the force of public opinion, whatever it is, right? Um, and so force is sort of this instrument in which uh, sovereigns bring about the good in their society. Okay. Um, Now, violence would be sort of you would think would automatically be geared towards uh, not necessarily correcting the person, but completely and totally subduing the person. Okay. And so if it helps, the church will tend to use the term force rather than violence, although, from the surface level, they almost appear to be the same. Um, but nevertheless, the sort of tradition of the church is um, that the use of force is always justified when you are trying to protect the innocent, recover something that's been unjustly taken, to defend against some sort of wrongful attack, um, and to punish evil in some way. Okay. And so all four of those things are goods, and force becomes a means in which we bring those about. Okay. Does everyone sort of grasp the distinction between force and violence? Okay. So when we're talking, we're mostly going to talk in terms of force. All right. So that's sort of where we're going to leave pacifism. Okay. And we're going to jump into the just war principles themselves. All right, so traditionally, we've sort of talked about pacifism, and then as we talked about very often, what happens is people will swing in the other equally opposite direction and make sort of the same mistake. And so what the just war doctrine is meant to do is to keep people from going from pacifism to militarism, where whatever all's love and fair, all is fair in love and war, and the just war is meant to be sort of this middle ground, this mean between the two extremes, and in which we can still act morally. Okay, and so in order to avoid that militaristic sort of approach, then we turn to the just war principles. And notice that sort of as a given, there's no idealism here, right? There's just the reality that evil exists in the world, and that there's times when evil has to be forcefully resisted, even to the point of using the sword. um, and then the idea then is to just figure out when those moments are, and when when we have to do something different. Okay. So typically there's two sort of groups of criteria. The first is whether to go to war or not, and that's typically called ad bellum, or just ad bellum, justice to go to war, and then once you've sort of exhausted those criteria, then there's how to act justly within war, which is you'll hear often called in bello or jus in bello. Um, and so you apply the first, sort of the bigger question of, is it okay to go to war in this situation? And then how do we act justly within the war? Okay. And most of what the church teaches is sort of summarizing, not like many other things where a lot of things in the church are just footnotes to St. Thomas. Um, it's sort of drawing on St. Thomas has a question in the Summa about war. And so we'll look to that a little bit. And so he gives three core criteria that are at the heart of just war moral reasoning. The first is proper authority. The second is a just cause. And then the third is having the right intention. Okay. And then just sort of, we can talk more about this maybe as we get towards the end and we have a little bit of Q&A time. This sort of criteria always applies to on a sort of an offensive war. Okay, if you're attacked and it becomes a defensive stance, then obviously you don't have to worry about whether or not to go to war. Okay, so again, this is sort of not, this is the error of the pacifist, right? So these apply to what we would call an offensive war. So before any of the conflict actually starts. Okay. And so a defensive war is always sort of repelling an enemy. Okay. And whereas the sort of offensive war is where someone has suffered an injustice, and in order to repair the justice, they're seeking to get reparation by using force. Okay. All right. So those are the three principles. We'll dive into each one individually. Okay. So just proper authority. In order for a war to be just, three things are necessary. First, the authority of the sovereign by whose command the war is to be waged. For it is not the business of a private individual to declare war, because he can seek for redress of his rights from the tribunal of his superior. Moreover, it is not the business of a private individual to summon together the people, which has to be done in wartime. And as the care of the commonweal is committed to those who are in authority, it is their business to watch over the commonweal of their city or kingdom or province subject to them. For this reason, Augustine says the natural order conducive to peace among mortals demands that the power to declare and counsel war should be in the hands of those who hold the supreme authority. Okay, so what he's essentially getting at here is that war can only be sort of declared by the person in authority. That and also to avoid sort of this a distinction between what we might call like a personal duel versus a war. So because the idea of a duel is if a person has been sort of slighted and now they have to go back at them. Okay, and there certainly are plenty of examples in history of that. But the problem with that, of course, is always that the personal duel sort of aspect of it is always dictated in some way by vengeance. Okay,
Hey,
so that's
Rob,
go ahead.
how does that apply to things like revolutions?
Uh, so yeah, so technically, in a certain sense, um, the proper authority would have to. That's where the one of the sort of just reasons to have a revolution would be that the proper authority has abused their authority in some way. And so it's not a usurpation; it's sort of a demanding of justice on the part of the people. And so typically, you wouldn't necessarily think about who has the proper authority to call a revolution. Although it's a good question, right? But it's in a way to try to wrest the improper use of authority away from a person who's abusing it. Because the goal of a revolution ought to be not for the revolutionaries themselves to go into power, but to put someone back on, in the power seat that's going to use authority correctly. Okay.
Which on that note, since all authorities will inevitably abuse their power in some manner, at what point would justify a revolution?
Yeah, it would have to be where it'd have to be something egregious, right? But it would also have to be something where the harm that would come about by you sort of trying to overthrow the governor, the king, whatever, is proportional to the sort of the effort in doing so. So the loss of life, whatever the sort of, so it has to be a proportional thing. And in that case, and some of that can be too, like just the idea of, okay, do we have someone else that can go into power, right? And are they worse than the person who's actually in power now? So yeah, it's not just necessarily the abuse; it's something sort of egregious, if that makes sense. Okay, so that's proper authority, just cause. In order for a war to be just, three things are necessary. And here's the second one. Secondly, a just cause is required, namely that those who are attacked should be attacked because they deserve it on account of some fault. Wherefore Augustine says, a just war is wont to be described as one that avenges wrongs, when a nation or state has to be punished for refusing to make amends for the wrongs inflicted by its subjects or to restore what it has seized unjustly. Okay, so the just cause is sort of motivated by the desire to rectify or prevent some injustice. Okay, and so the key again is that those who are attacked should be attacked because they deserve it on account of some fault. Okay, so let's say a country has shares a border with another country, and they take over some of their land. Okay, so they usurp the land, and then in usurping the land, the other country may come to use force to get the land back. Okay, and that would be a just cause. All right, or you could see even in a bigger picture, there can be humanitarian causes as well, where another country might go in to rectify some humanitarian injustice and so forth. And we can talk sort of at the end about some examples if you want. All right, third criteria is the right intention. Thirdly, it is necessary that the belligerents should have a rightful intention so that they intend the advancement of good or the avoidance of evil. Hence, Augustine says, true religion looks upon as peaceful those wars that are waged not for motives of aggrandizement or cruelty, but with the object of securing peace, of punishing evildoers and uplifting the good. All right, so this aspect of it is really important, right? So the right intention always has to be to bring about peace, okay? And so the right intention is to bring about justice so that peace can be restored, okay? And this is the idea of the idea of war really just being an instrument to bring about peace, okay? And then the other part that he talks about is that the intention must be to somehow stop the aggressor, right? Not to kill him, okay? And so the intention has to be to redress the wrong and correct the evildoer, but nevertheless not necessarily to kill them, okay? And so that right intention is vital for why if you look historically, why some wars are unjust, simply because the person is using it as an excuse to somehow gain land for themselves or gain something from it. Okay, but the intention always has to be that it brings about peace, and there's an attempt to stop some aggressor. Okay, all right. So those are the three sort of the three principles of sort of going to war. So a country will go, okay, we've suffered some injustice. Okay, this country has taken over our land. Okay, what are the assuming rightful authority? All right, is this a just cause? And then is our intention just to get the land back? Okay, and you can see how something like the Crusades, a great example, right, where the lands had been taken from the Christians, and the rightful authority, the Pope, calls this holy war and says we need to get back the Holy Land for the Christians. We need to free those people who are being held there, and so there's a wrong that's been done, and then has a right intention of returning it. In fact, right intention sort of almost plays out in the First Crusade, where the Christians actually stop in Jerusalem, and once they got back what had been taken from them, where they had gone another, say, 30 miles, we probably wouldn't even be talking about Islam any longer. So that's sort of an example of the three moral criteria. All right, so that's the question of whether we go to war. All right, now the other question, and which is a little bit more sort of compelling, is how we act during war. Okay, and so here is what the Catechism says. Okay, the first is non-combatants, wounded soldiers, and prisoners must be respected and treated humanely. Blind obedience does not suffice to excuse those who carry them out. Thus, the extermination of a people, nation, or ethnic minority must be condemned as a mortal sin. One is morally bound to resist orders that command genocide. Okay, so what is it getting at there? It's getting at this sort of idea that that you can't just target everyone. Okay, that you have to you sort of have to be discriminate in who you target. Okay. The second that they're talking about there is every act of war directed to the indiscriminate destruction of whole cities or vast areas with their inhabitants is a crime against God and man, which just ought to pique our ears as Americans, which merits firm and unequivocal condemnation. A danger of modern warfare is it provides the opportunity to those who possess modern scientific weapons, especially atomic, biological, chemical weapons, to commit such crimes. So the second part that they're talking about is proportionality. All right, and so the response has to be sort of proportional to the wrong that's done, right? So again, thinking of the land being stolen, you know, and the country goes in and they absolutely obliterate the other country so that they don't have any inhabitants that could live in their land anyway. And so there has to be there's always has to be this sort of proportionality between what's done and so what the church has now done with these is sort of come up with what we would call prudential criteria. Okay. So these are again sort of they flow out of the first consideration, that non-combatant discrimination. Okay. Again, the key word is innocent life. Okay, so we don't never in war should non-combatants, should women, should children ever be targeted. Okay, and then the second is again that that sort of proportionality where the damage inflicted by the aggressor on the nation or community of nations must be lasting, grave, and certain. So this idea of not sort of blowing up the smallest thing and making it into a big deal. And the second is that there has to be a sort of exhausting all other means. Okay. Now sometimes this one is sort of misunderstood because people think, okay, well, you know, we haven't tried every possible diplomatic means to make this thing not make them comply, and so I'm obligated to keep trying diplomatic means. What it means by sort of the last war is the last resort is that you've considered reasonably every other alternative. Okay, you don't have to sit forever and go, yeah, we haven't tried this yet. We haven't tried saying pretty please, right? It's the point is that you've tried all reasonable efforts, because very often the longer you postpone sort of military intervention, the worse off you end up, right? And so I don't know. We already talked about this, but there is no reason why a person, you know, may, in the sense of if they know that their enemy is going to attack. You know, if there's an imminent attack, there's no reason why they can't attack first. Okay, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. But one of the other things too is that there must be a serious, you know, chance of success. What success looks like though is very different, right? So again, if the goal is to get back our land, we get back our land. That's success. Okay. If we have this great loss of life, you know, then maybe you know that would not be the war is not the sort of idea to go, right? This is like one of the examples Jesus uses in the gospel, right, where he says, you know, what kind of general goes to battle without actually seeing how many soldiers he has and how many soldiers his enemy has, right? So it's always guided by this prudence. And then this last part we'll come back to when we sort of get to the nuclear question. Okay. All right. So so we sort of already hinted at this this idea of a preemptive war versus a preventative war. A preemptive war is characterized by a desire to strike first rather than second. The preventive war is one in which a nation seeks to strike sooner rather than later in order to offset a balance of power. Right. So preemptive wars can be just wars. Preventative wars cannot be just wars. Okay. And so preventative wars are sort of they're trying to sort of jump the gun on the other person, all right, and catch them by surprise. And it's sort of first of all, preventive wars don't sort of meet that last resort criterion. and they also don't follow proportionality because they're not responding to anything. All right. So certainly, preemptively, someone may say, okay, you could see something like this, say with North Korea, for example, where okay, we have nuclear capabilities. We're coming after you, America, and it's imminent that they're going to come after us, right? So the threat is real, and all other measures have sort of been exhausted, and so there's nothing morally wrong with striking first when you know that there's going to be a first strike if you don't. All right, and again, that's a moral certainty. Preventive war would say, okay, it looks like North Korea is going to have have nuclear power, and I think they may come after us. We need to just nip them in the bud militarily right now, and so we're going to go to war with them. Okay, so it's so there's no sort of no threat has been made, even if it's sort of a veiled threat in some respects. No one's sort of actively engaging in hostilities, but it's just an attempt to sort of balance, to sort of throw off the balance of power. All right. And so preemptive wars are legit when it comes to the just war. Preventive wars are not. All right. Any questions on all the principles, and then we can look at the sort of modern warfare approach to things.
Rob, one question I have is like, so like I'm, I guess, registered in the social, whatever it is, so like if my number gets called and I'm supposed to go to war, but how do I balance like the authority's judgment of whether the war is just in my own? You see what I'm saying? Like if it's certain for me that it's not just, then I should act accordingly. But if I'm not sure, see what I'm saying? Like,
yes. So so one of the things, it was up here and I didn't go into it. Let me just present the pacifism thing. In those cases where you were, for reasons of conscience, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're opposed to war as a pacifist, but let's say you're opposed to a war. As part of the common good, you have to serve the community in some way. All right. So in a just society, public authorities would make sort of this equitable provision for those who, reasons of conscience, refuse to bear arms. Okay. And so you would find some other way to serve the community, not as a soldier. Okay. Because nevertheless, it's a burden that the entire, that everyone is sort of suffering under. And so you have an obligation to serve the common good. Yeah, I mean, it's not a given that just because, because somebody's, declares war and that you should serve, right? I mean, this is a question that, sort of the question that that a lot of like Catholics in Germany under Hitler had to sort of figure out, right, on how they could avoid actually going into the German army. And some of them found ways to do that, some of them didn't, right? Pope Benedict, he was a little bit on the younger side, but he tells a story about his dad basically losing his livelihood because he refused to serve, and because it was the army or nothing, and so that may require, again, as we've talked about many times, about sort of suffering for the good. Any other questions?
I had one.
Go ahead, Nicole.
Go ahead, Nicole.
About, so like the not harming innocent people. I've heard stories about like in the Middle East, like certain groups forcing like women and children to stand in front of them as they're shooting. Like what would the opposing side, I mean, I would assume they would not want to shoot, but like how does that handled?
Yeah, I mean, I think the sort of the moral action would be, if someone is using an innocent person as a screen, that you don't shoot.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah,
And
I think
then, Rob,
yes, Andrew.
question on the second criteria, if you could go to that slide.
Sure.
Actually, third one, not second. It's kind of in both of them. So,
Okay.
it mentions punishing evildoers. I think in the second, it also says like avenging. So, how would you differentiate punishing evildoers versus like thirst for vengeance, as it says later there. Like, how do you balance that?
Yeah, I think like the idea would be that you're attempting to fix something that like fix the wrong and nothing more than that, right? So so often like this is why the church would say something like unconditional surrender, like demanding unconditional surrender is always wrong, right? Because if the person is sort of suing for peace, you can work out surrender terms, but demanding unconditional surrender sort of goes beyond. That's where you're like, okay, we're going to destroy you for this, rather than we're going to sort of redress a wrong and fix it. So there's always, I mean, even in our own lives, right? Even as a parent, like you have to sort of know where the line is, where you've crossed over between redressing a wrong versus just sort of getting your anger out, or it's something we do all the time, and so it's easy to cross over from one to the other, and it's not always clear when you have crossed over, right?
Right.
I'm just thinking, is there like some kind of a, I don't know, answer key from like a saint or reputable person with like examples of like what counts and what doesn't count as a just war, in history or something?
Yeah, there's a great book. His name is Michael Walzer is his name, and he just goes through historically, like just war. It's called Just and Unjust Wars is the name of the book. And I have a copy of it, and if you're really interested, I could certainly let you borrow it. He's not Catholic, but he is he's sort of one of the just like sort of the experts in just war theory, and definitely he understands the Catholic understanding. In fact, he probably understands and applies the Catholic understanding more than a lot of Catholics do. So I would recommend that. But yeah, he looks at throughout history all these sort of historical examples. And it's really kind of it's interesting because he even looks at, like, he looks at the Crusades. He looks at, I think, the 30 Years' War. I think he looks at the American Revolution, and he looks at. I don't think he looks at either one of the world wars because it's just it is obviously sort of difficult to look at individually. That way. I think he looks at the wars in like the 1800s and so forth. So yeah, so that book is definitely good to read because it gives sort of concrete examples.
Rob,
Yes.
is there so we say saying like you can't, or let's say, okay, you gave the example of two countries are bordering each other, and one country takes some of the land, and then the other country can respond with a sort of give back what was mine that you took.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a limit to how far that goes? Like, is there a certain time frame in which that stops being, or is there a certain point in which kind of almost the demands of justice stop being able to be applied?
Yeah, I'm sure there is. I mean, I can see what you're hinting at, but I don't know when necessarily that line would be. Certainly, did Israel have a right to that land after all that time? I don't know. I think that's a hard to. Certainly, it was theirs at some point, and you could maybe argue, maybe not, but there is a point where it no longer makes sense, but I don't know what that point is per se.
What about, this is kind of off topic, but like there's this like idea that white people in the US should give black people money or something to redress, like, is that kind of related? Like, a lot of people haven't, it's like you're dealing with the aftermath of discrimination in the past, but you have a lot of people who aren't personally responsible for it in the same way. Like, I don't know. Maybe that's what Connors was getting at. Like 200 years ago, your country took our land, like, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that's like a political hot like football. I mean,
You
and
don't have
of
to
course,
answer it.
I'd
I
probably
just-
give you like a non-politically correct answer, right? Like fixing an injustice. Injustice isn't fixed by committing another injustice, right? So, um, when I would just say if you're getting into multiple generations of people who have no connection to the land to begin with, your claim on it is a little suspect, right?
Yeah.
Because now you're demanding redress from people who didn't, necessarily have anything to do with it, um, be given to people who had nothing to do with it. So you're not even addressing the people who were harmed are no longer being addressed by the people who harmed them.
But some people would argue that, people are still kind of harmed in a sense just by like I don't know, the generations. Like it could have led, situations like that could have led, to poverty that people are still experiencing as a result.
Right. I think you would have a hard time. You'd have a hard time applying that injustice to, like, who bears the weight of the injustice, like
Yeah.
like, you to punish the wrong people is just as bad as not punishing at all, right? So
That's true. Just
I,
because
I
not
think
everyone.
I think you have trouble finding who to blame. Like you can't just, this is one of the reasons why I'm almost like scared to open Pandora's box. Like I think race is a stupid thing. Like ethnicity is a real thing, race is not, right? Like, can you really blame people that you call white from Poland who emigrated to the United States? Can you somehow blame them because their skin is white for the fact that that Puritans from England had slaves, right? So
Yeah.
it's this way of, it fits into the sort of the dialectic of there has to be conflict, so we have to break society into two different groups, and it's always the oppressed versus the oppressor, right? And so it's convenient to just group all people of somehow European descent, make them white. All people not even of African descent, because there's people in, that are black from Jamaica, for example, right? Like, and there's people walking around, like, there's a U.S. senator who repeatedly calls herself an African American, and she's from Jamaica, right? That's, that's really suspect, right? So, so you have to be careful about. Again, that's not to say that one ethnic group didn't treat another ethnic group poorly. But it's to recognize that sort of categorizing it into races way oversimplifies the problem, and all it does is try to set up this false sense of us versus them, which is the way that sort of modern society tends to it's out of Hegel, and then Marx grabbed it too, where Marx says, okay, all of history is conflict, and in the end the only way is for them to duke it out, and then for someone to come on top. So yeah, I tend not to think in, I tend not to put a whole lot of credence in things when someone's basing it totally on race, because it's not necessarily a real thing. It's you'll hear it, like people call it like a category of the mind, right? Where it's just this classification that people have made up to somehow make a narrative fit.
Mhm.
What were you gonna say,
Rob,
Andrew?
Can I say, can I bring this back to kind of a real world example in relation to like just war conflict?
That would be great.
Because so the best I can think of off the top of my head is like the civil war in Ukraine and Crimea,
Okay.
which I think that's all kind of still in limbo basically, but
Yeah, and I
same,
don't know
like,
all the details, so you may have to fill in me some of the details. I know of it, but I
even
don't
I
know.
don't remember all the details because it was like started 5 years ago, but basically the Crimean Peninsula was part of Ukraine, and then Russia basically seized the entire peninsula. And in the meantime, on the east side of Ukraine, you have all these rebellions because they want to join up with Russia because they have closer ethnic ties to it and such. And I never heard of it. I think they had a ceasefire, but I think something's still going on, or they're like kind of in limbo. let's say that rebellion was going on for 50 more years, and you have, you have Ukraine saying this land belongs to us, and people, because they live there, like, this belongs to us. But after 50 years, it kind of just almost doesn't matter, because the ones who are fighting then are not the ones now, and the ones fighting now are kind of just pulled into it because they live there or because they happen to be in the Ukraine army.
Yeah, I mean, I think that again, that's the timing thing, right? Like, um, I think like a good historical example is like Northern Ireland too, right? Like at a
Yeah.
certain point,
Oh,
they
that's
just
another good example.
they stopped fighting because they're like, why are we fighting again? Like they're just
Right.
like, okay, this makes no sense that we're doing this. You know, we've hated for generations, generations. Like initially, we thought maybe it's Protestants and Catholics, but nah, maybe not. And so it's just at a certain point, they just go, yeah, that doesn't make any sense, right? And that's another case where it was really just, you know, something culturally was vastly different between the two groups.
Mhm.
And so the land isn't, land and people aren't necessarily always tied together. Like you could see where, you know, especially in like Eastern Europe, where, you know, these groups are ethnically different, right? And there's really nothing that ties them. And so it may make sense to redraw borders. And in that case, they have a just claim on the land, right? Where they could say, you know, ethnically, we're different from you. We shouldn't be, you know, governed by you. And so we want this land that we've been living on, we want to take it with us. And that, you know, the sovereignty of the land doesn't necessarily just, it doesn't belong to the state, right? It belongs to the people themselves, right? So, and even again, like an example of like South Carolina seceding, like, you know, the United States didn't necessarily own their land, right? And you'd have a hard, you'd be hard pressed from just from a justice standpoint to say that what they did by seceding was unjust. You could certainly argue the other way, that going after them for that reason was unjust.
Wait, is this recent or?
He's talking about the Civil War.
Yeah, it was like 200 years ago or so,
Oh, okay.
something
I
like
think they're
that.
still talking about seceding.
Yeah.
I've
No, I
heard
mean,
I've
people are
heard
talking.
stuff about secessions, like in Oregon, for instance, but I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, and I mean, again, you know, just because some, you know, the state isn't the one that owns the land, right? Like it's the people tied to it. And if the people are, you know, different from the other people, somehow united, then you can see where, you know, they can have a just, sort of a just reason to make that claim.
So where do we get the land is the people's from? Because it seems like the authority is more like providentially whoever God gives it to.
Yeah, because the people ultimately are the ones who have to accept their rulers, right?
Hmm.
And that's where you would get the idea from. Especially in the case especially in the case of like, you know, states in the United States, it was more that the states joined up. You know, if they could freely join, you would think that they could freely also leave.
Yeah.
But again, can you make that same claim today? Maybe not, right? But certainly at that time, you know, less than 100 years from when, you know, when they first made the pact, you would think that it's perfectly reasonable that they could unmake it too.
I'm also wondering about this, like just from American history. Well, it seems like at one point in the world history, like Europe and maybe America too, like, and it's kind of sort of, maybe it seems like it's still happening today, kind of got this idea that like we're the intellectual elite and other countries don't know all the good stuff that we know. And so we're going to like colonialize the whole world and like spread all our good stuff to all of them. And then, you know, it's like, when can you say like, or for instance, like the Vietnam War, where it was like, it seems like the point was basically, I mean, there might have been a lot of bad motives, but like just on the principle of like communism's bad, let's fight it. You know, like does that count as just war? Because it seems like it's a bit different because they didn't really take anybody's land. They're just like kind of building this really awful political system somewhere else. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
so that can be so there can be humanitarian reasons,
Okay.
like if, you know, a group can't defend themselves. Vietnam is a tough one to sort of argue humanitarian reasons, because, you know, the CIA went in and killed the Vietnamese president, who was, you know, this devout Catholic, who they didn't like, and that created instability anyway. But in general, would it be unjust for a country like the United States to go in and say stop the spread of communism into a land, for humanitarian reasons? Not necessarily. I mean, that can be certainly a very just reason, in which you can think throughout history when so humanitarian wars there's nothing unjust about them just because you're not necessarily involved. Like, remember, you're trying to redress some grave injustice, right? So that certainly, if Vietnam was, to keep the Vietnamese from becoming communist, from a humanitarian standpoint, then it would be just. But there's certainly other historical sort of circumstances in that make it very, very, that right intention clearly was not there.
And I think Nicole's told me about, and I think maybe you've spoken about like anti-colonialism before. I think it's like more of a modern thing.
Yeah, well, certainly if you, like Africa is a great example. Like the Africans don't want countries from the West in there because, they're ruining their culture. And so there's this, it used to be like colonialism would be, like England would go into India and they would live there, and sort of engulf Indian culture in some way. Now we try to do this sort of colonialism it's called neocolonialism, from afar, where we just basically infuse our culture into their culture, and in so doing sort of kill their culture. And if you sort of understand most of the countries in Africa, they are completely and 100% opposed to that. And so that's sort of this neo-colonialism, and what they try to do is basically do it through, like aid is one of the ways they do it, right? Where they're like, okay, we have lots of money, we'll give you money, but you have to jump through these hoops. And usually the hoops have to do with sort of feeding the sexual revolution in through, especially into Africa, where we'll give you all this money if you will, distribute these birth control pills. It's the Gates Foundation is a big one for doing that. All right, other questions about this before we get into the really sticky nuclear question? All right, that's our preemptive versus. All right, so modern warfare. All right, so here's the question about basically, like, okay, what do we do with what we sort of call the ABCs, right? Where we have atomic war, we have biological war, we have chemical war, weapons. Okay, how do we maintain the just war in the face of that, right? And really, the question almost always comes down to proportionality. Is there a, can we maintain justice within the war itself when we have this weapon that clearly goes well beyond any sort of proportional response? All right, so here is what the Second Vatican Council said: the horror and perversity of war is immensely magnified by the addition of scientific weapons. For acts of war involving these weapons can inflict massive and indiscriminate destruction, thus going far beyond the bounds of legitimate defense. All of these considerations compel us to undertake an evaluation of war with an entirely new attitude. The men of our time must realize that they will have to give a somber reckoning of their deeds of war, for the course of the future will depend greatly on the decisions they make today. Any act of war aimed indiscriminately at the destruction of entire cities or extensive areas along with their population is a crime against God and man himself. It merits unequivocal and unhesitating condemnation. All right. So what is the church's sort of position then on Hiroshima and Nagasaki based on that?
The bomb shouldn't have been dropped.
Agreed.
Yeah. Yes. And so from a just war perspective, now, just to be clear, we sort of take those out because of what they did with opening Pandora's box, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But that was not the first sort of, even though it was the first use of an atomic bomb, the Allies had been obliterating German and Japanese cities for quite a while. and you like do a Google search on the firebombing of Dresden, and just look at the total destruction of that. Look at the firebombing of Tokyo, where they had 350 planes in the air dropping bomb after bomb after bomb on the city. So it's not just sort of the nuclear question, although that certainly factors into it because of the great damage you can do in such a short amount of time. But the point is that sort of modern war, at least the approaches to it, start to involve like whole populations of people without discrimination between combatants and civilians. Okay, so when the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there was no discrimination between soldiers versus non-combatants versus civilians. In fact, the target in Hiroshima was the cathedral in the middle of the city, was where they were aiming at, and they wanted to drop it right in the middle of the city. And so, classically, just wars were always limited wars. Okay, so they always, again, sought to do what they set out to do and nothing more, and not necessarily fight for unconditional surrender. And then, the case of Japan, that's sort of exactly what had happened. The Japanese had, for a while, sort of been suing for peace, but they wouldn't turn the emperor over. And the United States said no. No matter what, you're gonna surrender unconditionally. And then in the end, they ended up giving them back the emperor anyway. But nevertheless, that was sort of the approach. And so the question then becomes, with this along the same lines, is it now impossible to fight a sort of an offensive, what we call an offensive just war? And this is not a question that there's necessarily an answer to yet. And so there's a lot of sort of movement in the church to only speak in terms of war as being sort of defensive. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean wait till somebody strikes at you. But the only sort of just wars are ones that are fought defensively. So the question then becomes, okay, in the face of these extreme things like either atomic, biological, or chemical weapons, what categorizes as as sort of a proportional response, right? So is if you have, let's say you have Russian, you have nuclear subs in the North Sea somewhere, is it okay then to use a nuclear bomb on them when you're going to blow up those 3 subs, 4 subs, whatever, with a nuclear bomb where no one else is around, right? And you can see how you can't necessarily say, okay, nuclear bombs can't ever be used, because there might be a legitimate use in self-defense of them. The problem is the lack of the ability to sort of use them in a way that's limited. All right, and so that's the question sort of the nuclear bomb. I don't think that the church, I think Pope Francis has maybe said this on a couple of occasions. I don't think that the church is at the point of saying that something like a nuclear bomb it's always immoral to use it. I think that certainly its first use was immoral, but whether it's always immoral to use it, maybe absolutizing the situation a little bit too much. All right, questions about that, and then we can talk about deterrence. Okay. So
I guess I'm kind of confused because it seems like from the USCCB or Pope Francis that it seems like they were saying that, but maybe they meant, I don't know. They weren't.
Yeah,
They were talking about like to take out a military sub in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, like, because it seems like in almost any circumstance, if you put it anywhere on the land, like it's going to take out innocent people,
Yes. So a couple of things. So the USCCB, I think it was in like 1983 or something, put out a document about war and nuclear war, and specifically, most people, including most people in the church, kind of laugh at that document. It's really poorly written. really clearly has an agenda attached to it, really pretty inconsistent across the board. In one case, talking, it almost speaks out, two sides of this, two sides of their mouth, where they say at one point that there are just reasons, for which, a country might defend itself in war, and then, 3 sentences later it says that, war is always gravely immoral. So that being said, documents from the USCCB in general have no sort of magisterial weight behind them.
No.
Now certainly if, a pope says something, not in the manner that Pope Francis has at least said this, I think he said it mainly in sort of the context of either interviews or just sort of passing comments, about the grave immorality of nuclear bombs. But certainly if a pope were to come along and say it, it would carry obviously a little more magisterial weight. But just this group of bishops coming together and saying something doesn't necessarily carry. So you can sort of read it and then take it at its face value and then sort of evaluate their arguments. And so if you evaluate the arguments of at least the particular document that they put out, it really needed some work on it, and it sort of had, you could tell it had a political sort of agenda behind it.
Could you maybe, because I feel like it's kind of a bit of a struggle, because I guess like there's just so much. It seems like there's a lot of like maybe like more like devilish kind of like anti-Pope Francis force. It's like, because he does all these interviews and things, it's like pick something out that he said and then like get mad at him for it, but like, and then try to confuse Catholics and make them think that he's like, going off and like, contradicting, the faith by using, or he's like, it's like understanding that like there's a difference between when he uses his authority and when he's just like talking to you in the middle of a park or something. I don't know.
Yeah. So let me do this. I'm going to stop sharing this for a second, because I do have a quote of his and we can look at it, because context is everything, and I think this will help sort of bigger picture. So he is the Pope, and because when he says things, because of his office, they carry weight, and we shouldn't ever dismiss him. We shouldn't go, I don't particularly like this Pope because he's liberal or whatever, and dismiss him. But part of what can sometimes make things confusing is that he, the church hasn't yet caught up with the fact that it's easy to deal with a pope in the 21st century where never before did popes speak as much as Pope Francis does, right? Even probably even John Paul II, and he speaks off the cuff a lot. So this is from their November 10th, 2017. Pope Francis said in an address to a two-way conference on nuclear disarmament being hosted at the Vatican, he said the threat of nuclear weapons, the threat of their use as well as their very possession, is firmly to be condemned. Weapons of mass destruction, particularly nuclear weapons, create nothing but a false sense of security. They cannot constitute the basis for peaceful coexistence between members of the human family. All right, so everything he said, except for one thing, would fit with what every other pope has said, and that's that the threat of their use as well as their very possession is firmly to be condemned. He would be the first pope to say that, and that's again not to say that he, he's wrong, but that whatever that is he's saying goes beyond what other popes have said. Okay, and so when he says this in a setting such as this is where understanding the context is really important. He's not addressing the whole world when he says that, right? He's just addressing this one group, this one group with representatives from UN, the European Union, NATO, and and so he's not, his intention is not to teach, you know, to teach from his chair. And even if he's not necessarily saying it ex cathedra anyway, but he's not teaching as a universal teacher of the church, right? Because of his audience. Okay, and so the problem is that this stuff gets picked up, you know, whereas it didn't used to, and then it's disseminated to the whole world anyway. All right, and so that's always going to cause confusion, because and so that's where the criticism often comes in with him, is that that because he says things off the cuff and he's constantly you know, being recorded, that the question of, you know, whether what he's saying carries magisterial weight is always looming in the background. And when that question always looms in the background, people are always like, well, I don't agree with him, so it can't carry magisterial weight, or I do agree with him, it can't carry magisterial weight. It carries magisterial weight. So that's the issue, right? And so we have to evaluate not only what he's saying, but we also have to say, okay, where does this fit with tradition? And then, you know, at what level of authority is it being taught? Does that help, Kevin?
Yeah, I guess so. I think somewhere I saw, like, I guess this goes back to like obedience in the church isn't so simple necessarily. It's like there's different levels of documents and things, and so I think it helps to understand there's just like a big difference between like Pope St. John Paul II, you know, like at the Second Vatican Council versus like Pope St. John Paul II in a cafe, you know, like, I don't know.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. Elizabeth, you have a question?
Yeah, I think I maybe just need a little bit of clarification. But in terms of like cross-continental wars, I think I'm struggling a little bit to understand, like, the church being universal may have different justifications than a nation being on a single continent. Like, how do we justify our nation fighting with anyone except like Canada and Mexico and people in Southern America, instead of crossing an ocean when that may have like nothing to do with us?
Yeah, I mean, the way that the world sort of works now. So, for example, China, right? Let's just say, you know, that the interaction between the United States and China, even though they're not, they don't border each other, the interaction is such that in some way, you know, China is responsible, has done something gravely unjust to the United States. And the United States then says, well, you need to redress this wrong. And they try diplomatic means, and then they consider economic sanctions, and they consider and none of those things redress the wrong. Then certainly there might be a just reason for them to go to war. And again, it would have to be something, you know, fairly, you know, really serious, because of just the size of a war that would occur between China and the United States. But you can see at least how nations that don't have borders could easily grieve each other, have grievances against each other. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so we do and can take weight from things other than just physical obscurities. It can be related to market and whatever else economically.
Yeah, I mean, think of like, suppose it was revealed somehow, like suppose the whole like thing with Russia tinkering with our elections, and you know, suppose that thing really happened, and it leads to these catastrophic circumstances in the United States. Then the United States would have a right to sort of redress, to fix that wrong, and possibly even up to and including, you know, going to war.
Rob,
Yes.
were you done, Elizabeth? So let's take that case you just gave. You know, Russia violated, or, you know, interfered with the U.S. election.
Mm-hmm.
What would redress look like in that case? What would be the goal in going to, or what would we hope to gain from it?
Yeah, well, I would think the first would be maybe the admission that it happened, right? So that we could fix any damage they did here with it. And so, you know, that might not be necessarily a basis to go to war, but nevertheless, you know, the admission that it happened would be the first step. And let's just suppose they had somehow steered the election so that, you know, a Russian agent ended up in the White House or something. then we would say, okay, well, we need to, hold new elections, and so forth. So yeah, there would be. I guess it's too abstract to really come up with specific things, but certainly it could look like that. All right, so that sort of that nuclear approach, just sort of understanding that it's not as cut and clearly, the use of them was certainly was immoral when it was used, and we sort of opened Pandora's box when we did that, and unfortunately can't put it back. There's no way to sort of unsee or undo what we did. So let me get back with the slides here.
Rob, I'm wondering, because it seems like, if I think about it, in history, there's only been like those two bombs dropped on actual people, but there's been like tons and tons of like tests and like really huge, even bigger bombs than those were dropped, in like oceans in Russia. I think they even tested it before they like dropped it on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So like, what are we to make of that? I don't know. I mean,
you mean as far as the morality of the testing of them?
Yeah, I mean, I think Pope Francis made it pretty clear, like, don't do that. But like when other countries do it, like it's like you mentioned North Korea. It's like when you see Russia testing the bomb, it's like it's not like directly a reason to go to war against them. I guess that would be preventive, but it's like it's kind of scary. I don't know. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, and so this sort of ties into this last slide. It sort of two things sort of emerge from this, right? So, so the church has always said, and this is what Pope Francis was sort of talking about, that he's saying deterrence in and of itself, if using the bombs, especially indiscriminately, is wrong, then deterrence is also wrong. Okay, so deterrence is if something is wrong, then if you threaten to do that something, that in and of itself is wrong. So you can't threaten to do something immoral and somehow come out clean. But the question becomes, when the bombs keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger, right? Where you couldn't control the size of the explosion. You wouldn't use I don't even know what a big nuclear bomb is, but you wouldn't use it in an isolated situation. That's when it becomes really problematic. And just the nature of weapons and the way we use them. The only way people will ever actually stop using the atomic bomb is when it becomes obsolete, right? When they invent something else that's better. That's just the nature of the way warfare works, right? And so the question is, okay, I just realized today that the nuclear bombs, especially the size of the nuclear bombs we have, is wrong. What do I do about it, though? Right? Like, what do I do when I realize, okay, I can't use these, but I'm not sure those people over in China realize that, or I don't quite trust that the Russians aren't going to use it. So now we've got this sort of prisoner's dilemma, right? Where we know we're sort of doing something wrong, but we're doing it in order to protect ourselves. And so can I simply just say, well, my intention is simply to build this up so that the threat is always there, but and the threat gets so big that I'll never have to use them. And so that's why I have to be careful about coming up with these sort of, like, it's Pope Francis's job to condemn something he sees as morally wrong, right? Now, how nations get from there, from that principle, that level of principle, to their own situation, that's beyond him, right? That's beyond what he can say. And so, what would the United States do, to get out of this sort of trap of always having to have these nuclear armaments? And certainly you can envision ways of, the sort of the art of the possible, like we talked about, where you're trying to reduce them, right? You're trying to reduce the really big ones, and you're trying to get other countries to agree to reduce the really big ones. Having a missile defense system would be another sort of really important thing to, so that you didn't have to keep building them as a deterrent, where you had a different deterrent that didn't include threatening to blow people up, right? So that's the issue of why it can never be clean, right? And why the initial like dropping of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was, not just in the time was really bad, but it really, caused, undue harm from then until now and beyond. Like we can never undo that. And we can
Seems
never
that,
go ahead.
yeah, because I've also seen, I saw something on TV a long time ago about this like gas, like, I don't know if they were able, I think there was like an arms race or something, but this stuff was like, just a little bit of it would kill you in like 60 seconds. I mean, it was just like ridiculously deadly.
Is it like
Mhm.
Agent Orange? Or...
No, I mean like Agent Orange, but like on steroids, like
Yeah.
really super deadly, and like the same kind of thing was happening. I mean, that stuff almost sounds more destructive than the bomb. But I guess that would kind of fall in the same category.
Yeah.
Yeah, some of that was like, I don't know if it was the exact same situation, but you saw that in World War I as well, with all the different types of gas and other weapons they developed.
Right, but interesting enough, with those, with most of those, like those chemical weapons, I guess you'd call them, I guess from the horror of it, they really didn't play much of a role in World War II.
Yeah.
Now, certainly, there's been dictators since then that have, not hesitated to use chemical weapons, sometimes even against their own people. But it seems like that the fact that they, with the horror of it from World War I, was enough of a deterrent from that point forward not to use, not for these sort of major powers to use them.
Yeah.
And you would hope that would be, because in the end, right, like the people are trying to avoid another Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that's why they work as deterrents. So certainly in the end, the deterring power of them, also sort of plays into it, right? All right. Any other questions? All right. So I want to close. Go ahead.
It's a bit off topic, but I heard of like in the past, like you're trying to fight this castle, so people would like take a diseased cow and launch it into the like castle, like as a way of like biological, like. So is that wrong? It sounds kind of like
That sounds wrong.
unfair. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that again, since it's indiscriminate, I mean, you can't assume that all the people in the castle are, especially like a castle, right? Are they all combatants? I think any kind of weapon that indiscriminately affects people, because disease can quickly get out of control, right? Like,
Yeah.
Even if you just had, knights in there and they catch the disease and they go home and they give it to their family, and I'd say that's an indiscriminate targeting of.
Yeah.
I think in general, probably both chemical and biological weapons. I can't think of any way you could use those in a controlled setting, in which there could be a illicit use of them, right? I mean, it's the nuclear bomb is maybe you could find a controlled setting to use them in. I don't see any way you could find a controlled setting for the other ones.
So no cows.
Yeah, no mad cows.
Could you make a similar argument for something like artillery, whereas would that just be the application of it, like firing on a military base versus firing on a city?
Yeah, I would say firing on a city, so what people sort of what often happens with questions of just war is they substitute legitimate, principle of double effect. They substitute it with the lesser of two evils approach. And people do this all the time with just stuff in general, right? The lesser of two evils is not the Catholic understanding of, like, you never do evil so that good comes about. So you don't choose evils ever. And you certainly wouldn't choose the lesser of two evils. But there's times where you would, through the principle of double effect, you might permit some evil to occur so that some good comes about, right? Where you might permit. So suppose you decide to bomb a military installation, right? And you're not 100% sure that it's completely clear of civilians. You've done sort of due diligence, and you're like, okay, it's at night. Any civilians that work there should have cleared out. But it's not your intent to kill civilians, right? Your intent is to neutralize the military base. But you may be willing to tolerate that in neutralizing it, that some civilians get caught in it. And again, so you're not targeting the civilians, but you're willing to tolerate the fact that there are civilians there, and that's the sort of valid approach to the principle of double effect.
Rob?
Yes.
So in that example, you say, okay, I'm not going to put a number on it, but you've done your due diligence enough to say, okay, it is, let's say, likely, it's reasonable or likely or something like that would make it okay. There's not going to be civilians there.
Mm-hmm.
So the principle of double effect, if we say we can't do anything wrong, does that mean if we say, okay, I know there's one, this military base has however many people, I know there's one civilian there. Does the principle of double effect just completely take it off the table?
I don't know for sure. I don't know that I could say, like, yeah, I think in general I say yes. I would say that if you knew for certain that one civilian was there, then I think you couldn't bomb it. But if you were only, you think if you were somehow weren't sure, I think that would be you could probably still do it. You'd have to be absolutely sure, so that somehow that that is you're now weighing the you've lost the proportionality, right? Of because there's a certain respect where I can launch a bomb and it can it could go off target, right? And I know that, and so that's always has to go into the sort of calculus of whether to do it or not to.
I guess the principle or the condition of double effect that's violated there is not that the act you're doing has to be good. It's the proportionality of it, or well,
it has to be good, right? But the obviously the taking out of a military base, someone's like the enemy's military base, that's a good, right? But the proportionality comes in as you're up against an absolute. You may never deliberately take an innocent life, right? Whereas if you're not sure if there's any in there, you're no longer deliberately taking an innocent life, right?
So would it be that I guess in that way you are, because you're not taking the innocent life so that the military base is destroyed, because what you're doing is the taking of the innocent life and the destruction of the military base are equally caused by the act of you choosing to bomb the military base. It's just that you are now.
Yeah, so it's not a means. So with principle double effect, you never want the evil thing to be the means by which the good comes about, right? So it's not as if I found a civilian and I strapped a bomb to his back and made him run into the building, right? Like, so he's not the means by which the good comes about. He's just it would just be a side effect of the good, right? And so then when you're looking at the side effect of it, you go, okay, is it proportional to the good that's going to come about? And that's when the question comes in. And I think in truth that a human life, that you're up against a moral absolute, that you can never deliberately take a human life in that case, I think. Whereas if you were doing something like the ectopic pregnancy example we always use for principle double effect, right? Like there's a proportionality between the life of the mother and the life of the child, so that you could permit that evil to occur, even though it's foreseen and all of that, right? Now, some people argue and this is where it gets a little dicey, right? Where where there is a proportionality between the person and the taking out of the military. Let's say I know tomorrow morning that a missile is going out of that military base that's going to be launched against us. Now the calculus is a little different, right? Where an attack is imminent and I'm trying to stop that. Now it's a little more difficult to make the calculation. Although I still think that taking out a innocent civilian life in order for that not to happen, I think would still be wrong.
I mean, it seems like, at least my initial reaction to it is say, okay, that you can't strap the bomb to a civilian to send him into the building.
Mm-hmm.
I think that comes down very similar to like can I lie to the Nazis that ask me, if they're going to Jews in the house, where it's really, you almost kind of have to you have to subscribe to the idea that moral evils are always worse than natural evils.
Yes.
Because otherwise you're going to say it's the good of the many outweigh the good of the few.
Mm-hmm.
Some of these edge scenarios remind me of one time on Senior Brockman gave a homily where he talked about a soldier who had another person with a gun pointing it at his head, and all he did was he just made the sign of the cross, and the guy didn't shoot him. It's like it's just like sometimes you just I don't know how to get out of this, but
yeah, but the point is like to what Connor's saying is be willing to absorb the evil rather than become a cooperator in it, right?
Yeah.
That's ultimately, what it means to be a Christian. All right, last slide. This to me, I came across this not too long ago, and it's if you want to sort of be open your eyes to just how much the world changed. Go on YouTube and look at Fulton Sheen has a talk he gave, and he basically says that. Well, I'll read it and then we can talk about it. 8:15 in the morning. Let me move you guys' picture so I can actually see the quote. 8:15 in the morning on the 6th of August, 1945, the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima blotted out boundaries. There was no longer a boundary between the military and the civilian, between the helper and the helped, between the wounded and the nurse and the doctor, and the living and the dead. For even the living who escaped the bomb were already half dead. So here's what he says. He says, on that moment, so we broke down boundaries and limits, and from that time on, the world has said, we want no more limit. We want no one limiting me. We want no limits, no boundaries. And so he simply says, his point is that from that moment on, the world was never the same because it took away all of our boundaries, where with the value of life and discriminating between life, it meant nothing, which is pretty profound. So if you go on YouTube and search for his talk, you can see, and it's interesting how sort of prophetic Fulton Sheen was, because a lot of what he says is really spot on for our world today. So I've really been listening to him a lot, and he has some really good talks on sort of spiritual warfare, in sort of even in the political realm, how it becomes this field of spiritual warfare. So go on there and check that out, because it's really worth hearing the whole talk. All right, questions. All right, who wants to pray?
Can I?
Yeah.
So I know Augustine, or at least I think when I've read Aquinas talking about, I think it's where he talks about self-defense, and I think it might be where he addresses it. It might be where he first does the principle